All right, everybody, welcome back. We have had just an amazing day so far. We've had great panel discussions about rescuing truth from falsity. We've had a panel discussion on ensuring transparency, how we open up these social platforms to really get under the hood to figure out how they work, how they're affecting society, how we balance that with the needs for privacy and threading the needle of the transparency paradox. We have had an hour-long conversation with Nick Clegg at lunch, asking him some tough questions about what Facebook's responsibility is going forward. And today, we want to talk about, in this panel, reviving competition. And so, in my book, I describe how I feel like competition is actually the foundation of doing any of the other things that we need to do to fix the social media crises that we find ourselves in. And the reason for that is because it is the biggest driver of the incentives that the platforms have to change. That without competition, they really don't have much incentive to change, and that is a cornerstone of fixing the social media crises that we find ourselves in. But there are a lot of ways, different ways, debatable ways that we have for reviving competition in a social media economy that runs on network effects. There are a lot of different proposals. There's a lot of nuanced legal and economic arguments and details that really need to get that we need to get into. As we've said throughout today, this summit is about solutions. We're not going to sort of get on our soapboxes about the crisis. We're going to get on our soapboxes about the actual solutions. And so I'm super pumped to have this conversation with these four experts today, because they really are experts in this area from a number of different angles. We've got Joshua Gans from University of Toronto. We've got Marietje Schaake, who is president of the Cyber Peace Institute and International Policy Director, Director of Stanford Cyber Policy Center. We've got Zephyr Teachout, who's a professor at Fordham Law School, public servant. We'll get to all of them in a minute. And Albert Wenger, managing partner at Union Square Ventures, one of the most successful venture capitalists in the United States. And we've got a lot of differing ideas about how to revive competition. So I want to get straight into it. So look, there is market concentration in the social economy. I think I feel comfortable saying that. Whether or not there's monopoly, we can debate, but there is certainly market concentration. Facebook, Twitter, and to some extent Google, less so. Amazon, I'm saying this, that they are part of the social economy. Amazon is a company that may or may not be in market with market concentration, but let's define or concentrate our conversation around the social economy. Facebook, Google, and to some extent Twitter. Now, the roots of market concentration have a lot of different potential causes, including network effects, the economic phenomenon of the value of a company being greater, the greater number of users it has, which tends towards market concentrations. Economies that run on network effects tend toward market concentration because the bigger you get, the more advantage you have competitively. But there's also business practices, including mergers and acquisitions, rules governing API access and data access. There are a lot of these competing sort of causes of the market concentration that we see. So Zephyr, I want to start with you. You're a legal scholar, public servant, expert on antitrust. You wrote this great book, Break 'em Up. You've been a vocal advocate for breaking up big tech as well as big agriculture, big money, as you call them. Right now, there are state and federal antitrust cases pending in the United States against Facebook that essentially argue that the mergers of Instagram and WhatsApp, as well as Facebook's policies around API access, were all anti-competitive practices. So my first question to the panel, to you, Zephyr, to kick it off is, why is breaking up Facebook and perhaps Google the right solution for creating competition in the social economy? And how exactly would you advocate breaking up Facebook? Where would you break them up?
Yeah, great. And thanks for having me. And I won't go on my soapbox about what we are trying to solve, but we have to connect solutions to problems. So I just want to briefly talk about like a catalog, not a deep investigations. We're dealing with an array of issues, including concentration that is choking off innovation, concentration that is harming advertisers and small businesses, concentration that is leading to less competition for quality and privacy, which you have talked about. We are also dealing with a problem of a business model, targeted ads business model, which itself in basic communications infrastructure. We've never seen infrastructure driven or funded with this kind of business model that amplifies high conflict content. We have a problem of excessive political power, both in terms of lobbying and in terms of funding think tanks. We have we have a problem of a sort of core problem of feudalism in the journalistic sphere, both a business model that steals from local and working class journalism, and a model that makes all journalism, both the local and working class journalism and even the sort of elite subscription-based journalism, dependent on these gatekeepers for how they are ordered and how they are prioritized, creating a kind of feudal relationship that is really dangerous. And then along with all of that, and related to this last point, you have a problem of just a handful of people really controlling the communications infrastructure in our country. So what is the broad kind of traditional anti-monopoly toolbox for responding to this? And breaking up is one part of that toolbox. So coming to you from the 19th century, the toolbox includes horizontal breakups, which is, I think, what a lot of people think of when they think of breakups. That's Facebook and Instagram. Vertical breakups, especially important when you're dealing with essential infrastructure. I'll talk about that in a second, but why do we allow Google to own Google Maps? So vertical breakups. Restrictions on dominant companies from engaging in anti-competitive practices that would tend to lead to excessive market power. And then common carriage. And common carriage has always interacted with the breakup regimes as two pieces of a puzzle, not as an either or, which is, to Sanan's point, the traditional 19th century and forward response to business models that we as a society decide we want to be concentrated because of the network effect is to say, okay, you can be concentrated. That's good. But one, you can't own anything else. You can only be in one business. And two, we are going to subject you to a non-discrimination regime and an open access regime. So you can't treat different comers differently. That's sort of broadly the common carriage approach. And so I think all of these tools, oh, and there's others, including, Sanan, how could I forget interoperability since I'm talking to you? Which again, as I think as a standalone, not so much. In combination with breakups, incredibly powerful. And then mandatory licensing, which has always been a sort of key anti-monopoly tool. So when then approaching these array of problems, and I think these are very significant democratic problems, we should be thinking about all of those tools. These cases then are a part of that, but they are not all of that.
So let me ask you to put your lawyer hat on for a minute. I'm going to ask, I think, most, if not all, of the panelists this question at some point, and I'll try to weave it in. How strong are these antitrust cases? Didn't we have oversight over these mergers, and weren't they approved? I know they reserved the right to come back and look at them again, but I mean, isn't that going to chill acquisitions?
Well, I actually think this is one of Facebook's silliest responses. Okay. And it's their favorite. They're like, you can't do a do-over. No matter that you didn't know all the internal documents that have come to light, these sort of incredibly damning internal emails showing the anti-competitive illegal purpose behind the Instagram and WhatsApp acquisitions. So if you have a bad prosecutor who doesn't bring a case, and then 5 years later you learn some new information, you still bring the case. So first of all, yeah, the FTC was asleep on the job. And I think one of the incredible work of David Cicilline and others in their subcommittee really put to shame what the FTC should have done. Having said that, Facebook was lying to the FTC and we have new evidence. I think these cases are strong. I do think they reveal a weakness in our current antitrust regime that we should change, which is that a huge amount of energy and effort. I have a.
I love it. That is so this year's Zoom sort of zeitgeist. Thank you for that. And hello.
This is better than the BBC dad for sure.
And my son is in the other room. So.
But I forget exactly where I was.
It's okay. You were talking.
The key weakness, which is that we're going to spend a lot of time fighting about market definition.
Yes, I agree with that.
And I think the sort of the next generation laws, which we'll be looking at very soon, should make sure that we can that it's very clear that you can prove dominance in other ways without having this multi-year, extremely expensive, payday for economists around market definition.
So, Josh, I want to go to you. So. You're an economist. You've thought deeply about how we can create competition in the social economy. You've also studied network effects and written extensively about why we really need to achieve sustainable competition by thinking about interoperability and social network and data portability, what you've also called identity portability because of the complex network structures that you'd need to make portable here. So, a couple of questions to you that I'll kind of combine, and maybe you can take them together. Will breaking up the market leader in an economy that runs on network effects by itself work to create sustained competition? Why or why not? And explain to us, what are interoperability and social network portability, and how would legislating them create competition?
Well, yes, thank you. That's a great set of questions dear to my heart. My overall...
I've read the Hamilton paper.
Well, it actually goes back a lot longer. I wrote an initial paper proposing number portability when phone numbers were a thing and considered to be a driver of difficulty in switching between mobile phone and local phone networks. Here's the interesting thing. What outcome are we looking for? We're looking for an outcome where bad products do not drive out good products. And economists could argue forever about what bad and good mean, but we all know it when we see it. And one of the issues that we know is relative to nothing, Google and Facebook are great. Relative to what they could be, they're not. So the question is, how should we have a mechanism by which those products are improved? My concern about the breakup scenario is that it doesn't hit at the fundamental issue. That is that these products tend to coalesce into networks. And so we could break it up and then wait a few years after some disruption and reconsolidation, and consumers will then flock to a single network and we will be back at square one. Not to mention, it's not clear that the disruption is worth it. Not to mention, it's not clear exactly how to break them up, etc. So I tend to favor three separate points to dealing with and opening up competition. The first is the one you mentioned, which is our problem with Facebook, let's say in particular, is that if I want to leave Facebook for something better, if somebody else comes up with something better, what I regard as a better product, I don't get to choose that on my own. I have to convince everybody I'm linked to. The same thing could have evolved in telecommunications as well, but we mandated interoperability. That is, if you had a phone number, you could call a phone number on another network. And believe me, they tried not to do that. They knew that that was going to open up things. And they tried all manner of things to disincentivize that and make it asymmetric. But we eventually got there, and that's why we have, where it was previously not possible, considered possible, because we had these vertically integrated monopolies, competition in telephony. We probably don't have enough, we could have more or less, but the foundation technically is there. And everybody complained it was going to cost too much. It ended up costing nothing. So these are things we can do. You know, to be sure, is interoperability feasible? Is it possible for me to send a message to somebody else across networks? Well, I have news for you. The Facebook is so big that it is multiple networks already. They have already solved this problem. And so it is a matter of just extending the internal protocols for interpersonal communication. And it's just a communications network. We tend to dress it up as social media and news and other things like that. But essentially, it is people sending messages to one another. They're richer than they used to be. Some of them get broadcasted and some of them have conversations, but that's no different from before. So we can do that. That is a, you know, there is a way, if we have the will, to put in technical regulations that will open up networks and that will lay the basis for competitive pressure in the form of consumers exercising their exit options to get better things for them, and hopefully would get more diversity. The second part is that we have a situation, certainly during now and during any transition, where the network sets rules. It sets rules, for instance, for dealing with publishers and other things like that. And one of the complaints that has always been there is that they change the rules arbitrarily, and that affects people in different ways. Now, that's not a new thing. Every large corporation does that sort of thing. It's the one area where bigness is an issue. And the traditional way to deal with bigness in a lack of competitive setting is through what we call voice. That is, we give an ability for people affected to exercise voice, to raise concerns, and we give it a bit of teeth, usually through some form of regulation, oversight, response requirement. That was at least the substrate of some of the moves in Australia, although I believe they gave voice to a limited group of people and exactly the wrong people, but that's another part. But there is something to that. There's something to this Leviathan property that Google, Facebook, and this same complaint goes to Amazon and Apple just by their sheer size. We don't have to think about, are they a monopoly or not? They're big. They're big. That means it's harder to be responsive, and there's a good argument to say that there isn't enough pressure for that. The third thing that we need reform on, and this is one where I get closer to the idea of breaking up having a good role, and that is in the advertising markets themselves. These markets have many different functions and elements and a vertical stream to them, all the way from advertiser to publisher, with tools, exchanges, etc. However, they have been monopolized essentially by Google, have through acquisition and other mechanisms taken control in all of these things, and also have their own footprint in each and every one of them, some of them considerable. In a sense, they are setting in terms of market, and they're also the referee that's setting the rules, and we know that's a bad idea. Now, this wouldn't be an issue if we didn't really care about advertising markets, but the problem is they extend everywhere. They're the thing that drives the money into these other services. And eventually they have to get to the people who are really doing stuff and not siphoned off in some toll in the meantime. So basically you need a three-pronged attack of interoperability to open up to consumers, voice to make sure we have greater responsiveness to rule changes. And third, if there's one place to think about aggressive antitrust action, it's in advertising markets.
So full disclosure, as Zephyr alluded to, I've written extensively about how in markets with network effects, interoperability is really the high leverage point because if you break up the market leader, the market just tips back into market concentration unless you solve that interoperability problem. That's not an argument against breakup. It's an argument for interoperability. Oh, and by the way, the network connections are what create consumer surplus. So if you tear those connections apart without forcing them to be interoperable, you're actually going to lose the value creation in the process as well. You know, I want to comment on one other thing, Josh, which is, you know, I always get this question, which is, oh, isn't it going to be difficult to, you know, create interoperability? You know, I can't imagine, you know, sending a message from Facebook to Twitter. But if you look at the tech stack, if you look at the messaging stack, they all have the same messaging protocols. They have textual messages, video messages, now audio messages, and they have these disappearing stories. Every single one of them has a stories feature, whether it's Instagram or Twitter or LinkedIn. They've already developed the same common stack of messaging. That's been commoditized. Now it's just a matter of creating common standards that they can all apply to, right? Am I right about that?
I believe so. I believe it's opening up the standards, having it list. Now, that can be a whole fraught process as well. The problem with these things is we know what happens. They take time. So it's not like something you can get overnight. And that's going to be an issue here. This is one of those areas which we'd like these principles to be thought about earlier, but you know, that's the world that we live in. But I think there are some ways in which we could start moving along these ways. And, you know, in any sense, I think one thing about the breakup story without interoperability, you separate out Instagram from Facebook, any things that they have about interoperability will all of a sudden become very difficult, because now we have to say, are they broken up? Are they not broken up? So the threat would be quite interesting in terms of what it would be able to apply and allow other people to interface with. So I think that's something for study. I think this has gone on for a few years now, and I fear we are in this, I watch some of these debates going on, and we seem to be focused on a lot of things to do with Facebook and frustration and other things like that, rather than being very, very targeted on the things that we think we can achieve. My view of the political process is politicians have attention for one thing at a time, and a bit of unity on trying to work out what that is wouldn't go astray.
So, Marietje, I want to bring you into the conversation. You're not only the director of Stanford's Cyber Policy Center, but you've also been a member of Parliament in Europe, thinking about how the types of legislation that we are talking about today could be enacted and what the eventual outcomes of such policies could be. So I want to ask you to comment on a piece of legislation, a specific piece of legislation proposed recently in the EU, which is the Digital Markets Act, which is currently pending in front of the European Commission, which is designed to limit the market power of companies defined in the legislation as quote unquote gatekeepers. Mm-hmm. So can you describe what the Digital Markets Act proposes and how its specific proposals are designed to ensure competition in Europe?
Great. Well, thank you very much. Actually, the Digital Markets Act is one of many legislative proposals that are currently being pushed out by the European Commission and are now in the hands of the European Parliament and the governments of the EU member states. So these are ongoing processes which will hopefully by themselves, but also combined, will lead to, you know, better safeguards for the public interest. But the Digital Markets Act, which you asked about, aims to create more fairness in the digital economy. So it doesn't only focus on social media, but, you know, tech platforms essentially. And what it does is it spells out the responsibilities that are, you know, asked and required of these companies. So it also in some ways shows what other tools, what other market tools exist than breaking up the companies, even though there is talk about breaking up as an ultimate remedy, which I'll come back to later. And of course, breaking up companies is already an existing option in the EU's antitrust, or what they call competition laws. And by the way, on the Facebook case, the European Commission actually did fine Facebook 110 million euros for misinforming it about buying WhatsApp, but maybe we'll come back to that later. In any case, the Digital Markets Act expands the obligations and aims to regulate the gatekeepers of the digital world by imposing direct restrictions on their behavior. So in that sense, the Digital Markets Act takes the opposite approach to existing antitrust enforcement, because it's always imposed after an infringement has been found, whereas the Digital Markets Act spells out so-called ex-ante rules. So they constrain operators, or are supposed to constrain operators before any bad behavior might happen. And it does so in a proportionate way. So they spell out what it means to have a gatekeeper role, which is to have a strong economic position, a significant impact on the Europeans' internal market, and to be active in multiple countries. So operating core services, for example, search, social networking, advertising, or marketplaces in at least 3 EU member states with a turnover of 6.5 billion euros, which is, only a handful of companies, or a market capitalization of 65 billion euros. Gatekeepers then have a strong intermediation position, and they serve as a gateway. So, for example, having a user base larger than 45 million monthly end users, or 10,000 business users yearly. And they have to be, or might become, entrenched in a durable position in the market, so they're stable over time. So these gatekeepers are in the focus of scrutiny of the European legislative proposal, and they should be forced to open up proactively. And if they don't, penalties can be up to 10% of their annual turnover, and then repeat offenders may face being broken up. And so in this sense, the Digital Markets Act tries to address 2 problems, which is high barriers to entry and, anti-competitive practices, which have been mentioned. So what would also be in focus of this law is the combining of end user data. As Zephyr talked about, what is the market, or scoping the market. And here the idea would be that combining end user data from different sources without their consent would be problematic, because it could give the gatekeeper significant advantage over smaller rivals. We've seen, alleged that Amazon has done as much, monitoring buyers' behavior so that they would know which new products they could put on the market, so competing with their customers, essentially. Or, notions of combining all kinds of different functions of data, so navigation, email, news, search, and so on, to develop entirely new products. So the idea is that by restricting the combining of data from multiple sources, those gatekeepers cannot leverage their market power from one market to another at the expense of the smaller companies. And just before I conclude, I'll mention a set of other elements of this Digital Markets Act, which are that there cannot be self-preferencing, so ranking your own products higher than that of others. There has to be data portability, which was also mentioned, so to facilitate the portability of data. Then there's a prohibition on gatekeepers of using their data to compete with others, so no spying, it's called. And then there should be interoperability of ancillary services. So an obligation to allow third-party service providers, for example, payment providers, to run on their platforms, and to permit third-party app stores and software to operate on their operating system. So lots of attempts to go further than what antitrust rules that are already forceful have, and to do it before possible violations take place instead of investigating afterwards.
Yeah, so you use the word turnover, and for for our audience in the US, you mean that means revenue? Is that correct?
All right, revenue. That's right.
Yeah. Okay, but just to make sure that everybody understands what we mean by turnover, and it's kind of like what our esteemed senator from Massachusetts, Elizabeth Warren, has said: you can't be the referee and a player in the game at the same time. Is sort of one of the rules. So. Do you and by the way, 10% of annual total global turnover or revenue as a punishment is significant. We should highlight that that is a relatively that is teeth, and if you repeat offend, then break up. So Do you think this is going to work? I mean, like what are the pros and cons of the Digital Markets Act and creating sustainable competition as sort of the goal of this panel to talk about? Could it do more? Is it enough? Do you think it'll work?
Well, the proposals as they are currently, I do think would improve the status quo a great deal. I mean, obviously we're coming from I think a low point, right? Where there's alleged violations, where the timelines are very long, where the fines that are imposed are basically seen as the cost of doing business for a lot of these big corporations. And so sanctions don't even really hurt. And every year or month or week even that the process can be dragged out with appeals and such, there's benefit for the alleged breach of antitrust rules. So by bringing these rules forward, I do think you win time. And you also do your own sort of governmental due diligence by saying, this is what we expect of you. So there's perhaps less speculation about what is and is not proper behavior. It's made much more clear what is expected, but the Digital Markets Act should really be seen at least in tandem with the Digital Services Act, which pertains to social media companies in a big way, because it seeks to spell out their liabilities and responsibilities when it comes to content moderation. Then there's a new AI law that was just proposed this week. So I think altogether they can add up to a significant improvement of protection of people's rights, fairness in the economy, the public interest, and so on, democracy. But hopefully there will not be too much falling between the cracks, because if you have so many different pieces that have to end up working jointly, and they're still going to go through a political process. So just to remind everybody, because it can be confusing which kind of announcements come out of Brussels, the Digital Markets Act, Digital Service Act, AI law, they're not yet law. They're proposed, and the European Parliament and the governments of all member states still have to shine their light on it. And so it will come out looking differently on the other end of the political washing cycle, for sure. And so how it actually is going to look at the end, I don't know, but I think that the ambitions are significant, and that is definitely a step in the right direction.
Albert, I want to bring you in. You're a very successful venture capitalist here in the US. And by the way, I might add a PhD graduate of the MIT Sloan School. So welcome back. So I want to ask you to comment on the potential marketplace impacts of the proposals that we're hearing here from the perspective of industry. Which of these proposals are the most likely to create competition in the social economy in your mind? Could any of them have negative side effects that we're not thinking of? And thinking specifically, for instance, about Instagram and WhatsApp, the acquisitions, which were overseen and approved by the FTC, and Zephyr rightfully, pointed out, hey, there's new evidence that's come to light since then, and if you're a prosecutor and new evidence comes to light, you prosecute the case with the new evidence. My question to you from the business market perspective is, would this type of relitigating set a bad precedent? What are the likely effects of a potentially prolonged antitrust case on future mergers and acquisitions in the tech space going forward? Would it have a chilling effect? I mean, when you invest in a company, one of the strategic outcomes that you might be trying to achieve is a sale to another company. How would what we're talking about here affect the overall marketplace of mergers and acquisitions going forward in the social economy?
Yeah, let me maybe start at the other end and then come back to this, which is I think that the situation that we're currently in is terrible for innovation. And the first and foremost way that we as venture capital investors make money is by investing in innovation, in new things. So we are in favor of things that are pro-innovation. I would say that there is a concept that hasn't really been mentioned yet, because it's not a very commonly talked about concept. And it's a concept that goes beyond interoperability and is essentially programmability. So interoperability, I'm sort of saying Facebook and Twitter need to write to this standard so that your stuff can interoperate. Programmability means any third party can create a service that produces interoperability as its output. And I believe that this is something that we need to look at much more seriously in the digital realm, because it cuts across many of the things we've discussed. It also cuts across our programmability of these devices here. You know, we all carry a supercomputer in our pocket that can talk to any other supercomputer in the world. And yet our ability to program that to work on our behalf as end users or as through trusted third parties is extremely limited. So I believe this is a very important concept that needs to be pushed further into the sort of realm of what are the tools that are available. Why am I saying this? I'm saying this because let's take the social graph, for example. Facebook has, by all accounts, maybe the most complete social graph out there. We would like other people to be able to innovate on top of that and create innovative new services on top of that without having to ask Facebook for permission, or without being in a situation where Facebook can pull the rug out from under them from one day to the next, because Facebook can just say, you know what, violates the terms of service and you're gone, you know? So I believe that programmability is the thing we're really looking for. And I believe that it will cut across many of these things. It'll be the most powerful thing that we could possibly do to take power and shift it away from the existing networks back out to both end users and innovation. It comes with its own set of problems. I don't want to say that there's like some, you know, silver bullet solution that doesn't come with its own problems. You know, programmability gets you into things like, you know, well, now how do I trust somebody else that they will, if I delegate to them, that they will do good things on my behalf when I've delegated to them? That's one of the questions. For example, do I wind up with somebody scraping all my data and selling it to somebody else because I've delegated my programmability to them? Now, I do not want to punt on your question though, which is, I believe this idea that somehow a chill on M&A is bad for the venture capital business model, I think it's a complete sort of attempt to sort of say this is a bad idea, and I just don't buy any of it. We invest in companies because we think they're going to build good businesses, right, for the long term. And if you build a good business, you have many ways of making money. One of those is to be acquired. One of those is to go public. One of those is to pay dividends. There's many different ways. So I think folks ought to focus on finding good businesses. Regulators ought to focus on getting a lot of innovation going. There will be plenty of things for venture capitalists to do in that world.
Fantastic. So what do you think about Josh Hawley's new proposed legislation to cap acquisitions by companies greater than $100 billion?
I'm not sure what it's supposed to solve. I mean, I think that, you know,
he would say that it's supposed to solve the competition problem.
Yeah, I guess in my view, one of the things that is very different also about the digital age from the analog age that preceded it, is something we haven't really talked much about, is, you know, historically when you broke some things up, the things that you broke up had sort of, in a way, different infrastructures, right? But today in the digital world, it's computers and data, right? And so the other move that's always available to somebody who operates a big network is to just copy, you know, just implement the same features. It doesn't involve acquisition at all. So, you know, so just to say that, oh, by limiting acquisition, we're going to solve the problem, you just haven't solved the problem, because copying is a still available option. And so, you know, I do think that we need to have more powerful, we need to get at the more fundamental problem. And the fundamental problem is that we want these infrastructures to exist. We want them to be interconnected, but we want them to be, in my mind, programmable. That's how we can get innovation.
So I want to talk a little bit, I want to broaden this out a little bit to this notion of data. And I want to sort of go to the panel and see if I could get various perspectives on this, and you can just kind of jump in with your answers, which is that, can we make any of these changes without being more explicit about defining data ownership more specifically? You know, should users own their own data? How do you get social network portability without thinking about where the locus of control, legal rights to data are? And should firms have to contract with users for the rights of their data? You know, what about data, definitions of data ownership? Is that part of this problem in terms of the solutions that we've seen? Josh, I see you shaking your head.
Yeah, I don't think it is. Strike me as cynical. When I hear contract, I hear consumers clicking agree on terms and conditions. So therefore, nothing. But really, I don't think data is at the heart of it. In fact, the Google's and Facebook and Apple's and co all recognize that right from the start. They let you take your data anywhere. They're very clear about that. They've made these processes. And why did they do it? Because that wasn't the core of the issue. And that was a useful thing. There is some usefulness to having that, especially if you're switching email providers, but it's not a huge thing. What I have in mind is a ability. I mean, you can call it data. I don't think people would think of it that way, but it's an ability to do addressing. Is if I wanted to leave Facebook, I would like to do a post of an update. Look, here's a funny picture of a Zephyr teacher at the balloon going across, and I'd like to send it to all my friends. That's what I'd like to do. Currently, I have to do that on Facebook with those people. What I'd like to do it is on my other platform, I don't know what that is, and click on it, and it would still go to all the Facebook people because I've got their numbers in my address book, and that's where the permissions go. And it will be able to flow to them. It won't flow to them with ads. It won't flow to them maybe with some features that Facebook put on top of it that I might have been able to edit it, and things like that. But it will flow to them. So that basically takes that cost to me of switching to my preferred outlet all the way network down. And the point about interoperability is you mentioned about network effects. It reduces the anti-competitive side of the network effects by making everyone part of the network. That's what you want to do. We like networks. We just want more people to be part of it. And I see this in Albert is also saying about programmable things. And I look at that and say, the tech visionary. Here's how he would design it from the ground up to have it do all that. And boy, I wish we could do stuff like that. But
we can't today. We can't today.
Oh,
every one of these systems is on an API. Every one of them.
Of course you can.
So
it's not about that. We can do a lot of things today. We can give everybody a pony if we really wanted to.
But there's nothing visionary about it. It's how it works today.
No. But you need to get enough people to agree about it. So the thing, I'm not challenging the technical solution or the vision. I'm concerned about the set of interests that currently go in this, and that's my issue. But anyway, let me.
Well, I completely agree with this sort of skepticism, and I would go even farther. I think it's a very specific strategic move on the part of big tech companies to talk about something that sounds like empowerment but is not, which is data ownership. And so if I am a farmer and John Deere is collecting my data, and then I suddenly have a new law passed in Minnesota, which gives me ownership rights over that data, that just adds a little click to the contract. First of all, I can't use it. I don't know how to combine it with other parties. It doesn't actually change the power dynamic. So what we are talking about, and this also I think is, I just want to make this point very explicitly because I didn't get a chance to, about the limits of interoperability, which is, let's just take Facebook and Instagram and WhatsApp. If you have, as Albert was referring to, if you have a copy or kill, copy, acquire, or kill strategy, which is what we sort of see in both Facebook and Google, and you add interop, you still have a lot of those tools. And Eric Gunderson of MacBox testified to this in a recent hearing that Google has an arrangement with Ford on maps. So guess what? Eric doesn't even have it doesn't have a way in the door at Ford because of the other arrangements. And so you have to actually change the power dynamics to allow for the kinds of innovation that we're talking about. You can't do interoperable alone, or Albert's platform
programmability. Yeah, Zephyr, I completely agree with that. Interoperability doesn't solve the acquisition of competitors' problem. So let me ask you about.
Or copy though.
Or
And
copy, or
right,
copy.
because we
Agreed.
sometimes, merger review is important, but there's a lot of other ways to leverage a dominant position that also destroy both innovation and.
It looks like you went to mute.
Sorry, yeah, that leads to the other.
And I would add a third to that, which is the API access, where you need the data in order to be able to produce a new competitive service. And I would add even one more piece on that, which is analogous to the regulatory forcing of access to switches in telecommunications, which is that you have to have a massive data infrastructure to process all of this data as well. And, you know, we force telecommunications companies to make switches available at 0 rated, right? And so should Facebook, maybe we would ask Marietje or Josh, should we make Facebook give access to new innovative companies, access to their, their data processing infrastructure at 0 rated cost in order to be able to compete with the larger companies that can process massive amounts of data? Josh, you put your hand up. Marietje, I don't know if you have a thought on that.
Let me briefly comment. I'd go further than that. I don't understand. The big problem we have is that Facebook have decided that's not in their interest. So we all agree that it's easy to do. And somewhere along the line, they've decided what's in their interest. Now, they'll tell you it's all now about privacy or some other thing. But it is also about an attitude about squashing competition and stamping it out. So somehow our regime isn't working that way. Now, we've seen a counterpoint to that very recently, and that is Apple opening up its Find My network to third-party devices to locate your keys and things like that. I'm telling you, 2 years ago, I would never have expected to see that. Apple always does its own thing first, a very integrated solution. But this time, prior to launching its own product, it had a third-party availability announced and already programmed in. So the question is, why isn't the pressure and other things applying that way on all companies? Why haven't we seen the transformation that, for instance, has occurred in Microsoft in terms of its attitude towards these things purvey? And I find that a puzzle, but it's a reasonable question to ask, because if that can work, that is the most efficient way to get what we want.
It's how it works with open banking, right? I mean, we could mandate that any API that the company uses internally to produce its service needs to be available externally. That would be the simple mandate that makes programmability a reality. So it's not some like technological dream or anything, as you characterized it earlier. It's that the reality is the Facebook app talks to Facebook through the Facebook API. I, as a consumer, should have the right to access that same API programmatically. Just like in the open banking initiative, every bank account in Europe comes with an API that I can point all other financial services to. So we are already doing this in one area. If we did this broadly, we would be having far fewer of these discussions. And I actually think it solves many of the problems, including the copying problem, because it means it doesn't matter if a service copies something. If I don't want to use it, that part of it, I don't have to use that part of it. And I can use that part of it from any other way. The addressability that you proposed is only one half of the problem, right? Because if I had everybody's address, but they never look at any other service other than Facebook, the only way to get something to them is through Facebook. And programmability, which is API access, solves that problem.
Marietje, did I see you wanting to jump in here?
Well, I agree that this is a question of power, which Zephyr also said. It's really about, who has agency in an ecosystem. And I feel like a lot of the solutions that are proposed now are either putting incredible responsibility on the individual, which, it doesn't solve the power asymmetry, because we've heard a couple of examples in this panel alone that you're presented with this big, green, well-designed, nudgy button to say, yep, let's go, even if you theoretically have a choice. But I mean, we have in Europe had this cookie law, which I don't think you have the equivalent in the US, and maybe you should count your blessings. But the idea was really that, it would give people more choice, but it's not an actual choice, because what kind of a switchboard are you looking at? And it's like hindrance over hindrance over hindrance. And then, so the question is really, who do we expect to take ownership of rebalancing the power asymmetry. And I think it will be part regulation, which has been mentioned in a number of examples. You know, the regulation can facilitate more access, more competition, but also, as it has, for example, facilitate better handling of data, separating out, you know, personal data and less sensitive data, for example. I think what's missing from a lot of the discussions is the collective impact of the processing of data, because by bringing everything back to the individual, we also really miss some of the collective processing of data, which still disproportionately benefits big tech companies. So once you start looking at the question of data and who should own it, who should handle it in which way, you have to acknowledge that this is about power relationships, and you cannot bring it back to, oh, well, people should have a choice, because people are not empowered to take the right choices. And therefore, I think regulation plays a role to, you know, prioritize, for example, privacy protection or the public interest, or, you know, access to information, another aspect of data. Because if you cannot really assess the choice or the processing that you are confronted with, then, you know, what effective agency do you have? I would say very little.
So can I speak to the power for 1 second? Because I think that this hits the nail on the head. It's all about power. When I talk about programmability, though, I'm not talking about each individual here having to be a programmer at all. I'm talking about the ability to delegate to third parties. And we had a brief moment of the world where this was true, and that's the world of the web. The web, I can run an ad blocker plugin. I don't have to write it. Somebody else can write it for me. You know, ad block is a perfect example of the kind of thing I was able to do on the web, but that I cannot do in this world, which is hermetically sealed. So we had a brief moment of where we gave the end user the power. And sure enough, lo and behold, end users actually made use of that power, not directly themselves. It's because third parties were empowered to act powerfully on their behalf. And like cookies is a good example as well. Because the regulation didn't think about it through a realm of programmability, thought of it through UX boxes, we've actually created a worse user experience and have less empowered the user. So that's kind of, so I think fundamentally we need to think in this world, one side operates a large number of computers and the other side operates like we operate our fingers and our, you know, our brains. And so to shift the power means to give us access to computers as well, basically.
So I want to get to some audience questions, and actually there's one on exactly the point you just made, Albert. So I'm going to save that one for last. But I want to get to this one, which is, you know, fines, they're treated as a cost of doing business. So and they don't change mega corporations' behavior. What are the other options? Can you ban players from the market for some finite period of time? My friend Scott Galloway likes to say we need to see a perp walk in social media. He wants to see Mark Zuckerberg in chains. And so what are our options here?
Well, I want to talk about our options, but I also want to just remind people, when you're talking about antitrust, the Sherman Antitrust Act has criminal elements, because, and we don't think this way now, but we should return to it. These are parties who are standing in choke point places and stealing. You know, that once you see antitrust violations or monopolization blocking as a form of theft, and the seriousness, the democratic seriousness as well as the economic seriousness is being very significant. So clearly in the US, we need on mergers to, instead of waving mergers through with conditions, block the mergers, just block the mergers. It's okay. You know, like you can do it. Second, and then like some serious clawback provisions. If people lie in the course of a merger, that merger is gone and there's a serious penalty, and there's personal penalties for those lies associated with it. But it's certainly, I think you need basically breakup remedies instead of condition-based remedies as well. I mean, Europe has had its share of laws that look like they might roar, but then they're, you know, baby teeth.
Yeah.
Marietje, did you have a Marietje? Sorry.
No problem. Well, I think there's more that can be done if there's thinking outside of the box, and it's not only about antitrust, but Zephyr mentioned licensing before. I mean, imagine that tech companies or software companies are no longer on the trusted list of governments when they misbehave. That's a big loss, like no longer participating in public procurement, you know, personal liability for board members, for example, and higher fines. and faster processes, because it's not only the lack of sanctions that bite, as we discussed, but it's also about just the ability to drag out this process for so long that essentially the case loses its relevance. In so many tech developments, the impact of change is so fast that, for example, if you're trying to challenge illegal downloading and you can appeal for 10 years, by the time you've settled the case, downloading is no longer a thing. People stream or otherwise. So it's here again, it's about like, are the remedies sort of in line with the misbehavior or the impact on society? And I would say often they're not right now, and it needs to be corrected. And I agree completely, this should not only be a paper reality, it should be an actual lived and felt and experienced reality that has consequences.
So just to get even a little bit deeper into the root causes of our inability to deal with anti-competitive practices and market concentration, how do we deal with the outsized influence of corporate lobbying on this process? Do we also need to all of this go hand in hand with more fundamental limits on lobbying, stricter campaign finance legislation? Anybody?
Yes, yes, and yes.
Is it that simple?
Second that.
Second that. Yeah.
Yes, yes, and yes, but I don't want to go to another antitrust conference where people say, oh, you have problems with the democratic aspect, just deal with campaign finance. This is also a democratic problem. So yes, both, but don't say it's their problem.
Right. And when you say democratic, you mean democracy, not Democrat, the political party.
Yeah. So it's at this point of these discussions where I like to remind everybody of what happened in Australia during the 2000s. In Australia during the 2000s, we had a very activist head of the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission who knew how to play the public relations game. And competition, and was basically one of the most recognized public figures in the country. And what would happen is that competition issues would be the top of the news. Not in the way that we have it here, sort of whining about Facebook, just but obscure industries like gas, electricity. I know that's obscure, but these issues would rise, and he would hold a press conference, and he would be the top of the nightly news. And I know for a fact, because I worked in this environment, companies feared the response from the Australian Competition and Communication Commission in terms of what's going to do to the news cycle, because they have brands, they have other things they're trying to do, and those are, they claim their most valuable assets, and I think they act like it is in many respects. And so you have this ability to change the terms of the debate and to change some of those relationships when it is believed that things that look anti-competitive are going to get pushed back. So what we saw there were mergers that could easily have passed according to precedent and legal matters, but did not go ahead because they feared the blowback during the process. And there's kind of something nice to that entire more inclusive mechanism. And I fear that we've never let our antitrust authorities in the US, and certainly here in Canada, off the leash in this regard, and to take a much bigger public role. And I think there's a bit of a basis going on with that in the United States at the moment because of the tech backlash. But I would love to see that translate into very consistent and relentless public education on this front, because I think that will cure a lot of the problems before they actually happen.
So this has been amazing. I sincerely appreciate all four of you taking the time to have this conversation. I know all of you are extremely busy with everything from very important work-related matters to dealing with floating balloons and sick-ish toddlers. Zephyr, thank you for that. Thank you to all of you. I really believe that we need to have these conversations more and more. I know that we have a lot of conferences, but I think that a lot of those conferences get mired in sort of the intro level conversations about what's the problem. But I really think that we need to get actually into the nuance of the detailed proposals for the solutions and really think through rigorously, what those solutions could be and how and what kind of effect they could have. And so I really, really appreciate the way in which we did that in this panel, and I really appreciate all of your guidance. So thank you very much. To the rest of the audience, we will be back very shortly with the next panel on humanizing design. So see you in a minute.